with chapter 18, verse 38. Verse 38 down through verse 40. And as you see in your sermon outline, if you picked one of those up and on the screen, the title of the message this morning is, What Will You Do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus? John chapter 18, beginning in verse 38. Pilate said to him, and that's Jesus, of course, Pilate said to Jesus, What is truth? And when he had heard this, he went out again to the Jews, this is Pilate, and said to them, I find no guilt in him. But you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews? So they cried out again, saying, Not this man, not Jesus, but Barabbas. But Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber, John tells us there. I try to avoid exaggeration when I preach. I think you would most agree with that. So keep that in mind when I say this. The question before us today is the most important question you will ever answer. That's not exaggeration. That is not hyperbole. The question for today is the most important question you can answer. The decision you make about this question is the most important decision you will ever make in this life. And here's the question. What will you do with Jesus? What will you do with Jesus? And how you answer that determines something far more important than who your spouse will be, or what you will do for a career, or where you will live, or where you will go to school, because the answer to that one question will determine your eternity. Your eternity. And that's no exaggeration. What will you do with Jesus? That's the question Pilate voiced over 2,000 years ago during Jesus' trial. And when Pilate voiced that question, there was great frustration and desperation in that question because his back was against the wall. Pilate found himself backed into a corner with very few good options. He had to render a verdict about Jesus. He had to give a legal opinion that would determine what happened to Jesus in the next few hours. Pilate didn't want to make that decision. He did not want to render that verdict. He didn't want to be in this situation at all, but here he was. If he made the wrong decision, the consequences would be dire. His wife had already weighed in on this matter about what he should do with Jesus, and does he listen to her or does he not listen to her? But it all boiled down to that question, what will I do with Jesus? Of course, if you've been with us, you realize that we're on the verge of the crucifixion here. This was the last step in the illegal legal proceedings against Jesus. It was not at this point a matter of if Jesus would die, but rather when it would happen. And so that's the issue that we're facing this morning. So let's see from the text how we got to this question that Pilate asked and that we still have to answer today. And so the first thing I want you to see is Pilate's dilemma. Pilate's dilemma. Pilate had a problem. He had a dilemma. He was in a situation that was not favorable to him. But before we figure that out, we need to know something about Pilate. We need to know something about his job, his position over Israel, because that's what put him in such a dilemma with Jesus' trial. You might remember from history that at this point, Israel was under the domination of Rome. Rome was occupying Israel. And so Pilate served as the Roman representative in Israel. He served at the pleasure of whoever was Caesar, which in this case at this time was Tiberius. And so you had Rome, the Roman Empire, you had this little place called Israel that Rome occupied, but Rome's representative, Rome's ruler locally in Israel was this man named Pilate. And so Pilate had this difficult situation because on the one hand he had his boss, he had Tiberius, he had Rome that he had to please. But on the other hand, he had these Jewish people that he had to keep happy, right? Because if he didn't keep the Jewish people happy, they would cause problems for him by talking to Rome and explaining all of their frustrations, right? If you've been around a while, if you're my age or older, you've probably heard the adage that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Now, if you don't understand that, don't Google it now. Wait till you get home. If you're my age or older, you probably understand. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. Pilate did not want his district, Israel, to be the squeaky wheel that needed some grease from Rome, right? He did not want anything to happen in Israel that would call attention to himself, to Tiberius. So he had to walk that fine line of keeping the Jewish people happy while ruling over them. As a matter of fact, when he started to rule, he made a couple of very serious blunders. You can look at that up and read about it. I don't have time. But after those two blunders, the Jewish people were very angry at him, and they complained to Tiberius. Tiberius texted Pilate and said, "You need to show up in Rome right away, ASAP." He goes to Rome. He gets a tongue lashing. He gets threatened. He gets sent back to Israel, I'm sure with the warning, if you have to come up here for this meeting again, it's going to be very bad for you, right? And so the pressure was on Pilate, especially with this trial. He had a dilemma. This had the potential of blowing up in his face no matter what he did. So bad things could go even worse. So here, the trial of Jesus, the crowd is growing larger in number, and they're growing larger in their anger and their restlessness. I think at this point, Pilate was somewhat of a fair man. I think he wanted to see the law carried out somewhat, and he did not want to sentence an innocent man to death, which was what was being asked of him. And he made that very clear. As a matter of fact, I've given you the verses from Luke's account of this where he made that very clear. In Luke chapter 23, we see him do this. Look in verse 4 of Luke 23. Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no guilt in this man. There's nothing here for me to act on." And then in verses 14 and 15, he said essentially the same thing. He said to them, "You brought this man, Jesus, to me as one who incites the people to rebellion. And behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man regarding the charges which you make against him. No, nor has Herod, for he sent him back to us, and behold, nothing deserving death has been done by him." And then one more, verse 22 of that same chapter, there in Luke. He said to them the third time. Do you see that? The third time. "Why? What evil has this man done? I have found nothing in him. I have found in him no guilt demanding death." 3 times Pilate rendered his legal opinion, and the legal opinion was what? Not guilty. Not guilty. Pilate is desperately trying to keep an innocent man, Jesus, from being put to death. Why? Why would he do that? Well, I think his guilty conscience was one thing. I think he was worried about having to live with his conscience the rest of his life if he was responsible for killing this innocent man. But I think more than that, he was worried about that crowd outside. He was worried about this growing crowd and the problems that would cause for him if they decided to riot. He knew that just a week before, right, early the same week, there was a huge crowd of Jewish people lining the streets leading into Jerusalem. And as Jesus came in, those Jewish people were shouting, "Hosanna to the King." They were, in fact, in a way, worshiping Jesus. And now, part, presumably, of that same crowd is gathered outside of his palace, waiting on this verdict. And he was afraid that if he said guilty and put him to death, that crowd would be incited to riot. And word would get back to his bosses in Rome, and that would be bad news. But at the same time, he had the Jewish leaders who wanted Jesus put to death, and they could cause problems because if he let Jesus go, their first call would be to who? To Tiberius. In fact, they blackmailed. The Jewish leaders essentially blackmailed Pilate into killing Jesus. Look at what the Jewish leaders said. This is found in John chapter 19. As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release Jesus. But the Jews cried out, saying, if you release this man, who? Jesus, you are no friend of Caesar. Aha! Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar. What did they say? What did they do? They blackmailed Pilate. They said, if you don't kill this man, we're going to tell Tiberius, and he's going to take care of you. So he's essentially blackmailed into this decision. You see this dilemma Pilate's in? I almost feel sorry for the guy, right? Because he was in a no-win situation. Anything he did was going to be the wrong thing. By the way, y'all listen to me now. There's a lesson in that about doing the right thing, right? This is a part. This is free. There's a lesson about doing the right thing. And here's the lesson. You always do the right thing even if it's the unpopular thing, right? Because that's what got Pilate in trouble. He was trying to figure out how he could do the right thing that was also the popular thing when the right thing was not going to be the popular thing. So what do we do in our lives? How about let's strive to do the right thing whether it's popular or not, right? That's where Pilate had a problem. He had a dilemma. The second thing I want you to see from the text is this, and that is Pilate's plan. His plan. He was trying to figure out a way to get out of this. You got to give it to him for creativity. And so he had some things that he was going to try. His first plan was to essentially recuse himself from the case. Luke tells us that at some point in all these conversations with Jesus, Pilate finds out that Jesus was really from Galilee. Pilate says, aha, you're not really even in my jurisdiction. This is out of my jurisdiction. I should not even be rendering a verdict here. So Pilate had Jesus sent to Herod, thinking Herod would take care of it and relieve the problem that he had. Well, Herod saw right through that, and Herod sent Jesus back to Pilate and said, no, you take care of it. Then Pilate said, well, okay, maybe I can appease the crowd if I have Jesus scourged, if I have him whipped. And that was a brutal thing. It's a brutal thing to scourge someone in first century Rome. But he thought, this bloodthirsty crowd, maybe they'll leave us alone. I'll have Jesus beaten and then release him, and they'll be okay with that. So he did that. Remember, he'd already said 3 times, not guilty, but he had Jesus beaten for no reason, thinking that would appease the crowd. Well, guess what the crowd did? They just cried for more blood. You can't appease the crowd. You can't appease a bloodthirsty crowd, and he found that out. So that didn't work. Then he had another idea. It was a long shot, he probably thought, but it was the best he had at this point. He knew of a tradition that was connected to the Jewish feast of Passover. You're familiar with that word, Passover. The tradition was this. During the Passover season, one Jewish prisoner would be released from prison to commemorate the Jews being released from bondage back in Egypt, hundreds of years before this, right? You're familiar with that story. If you look in verse 39 again in John 18, you see that. Pilate said to the people, you have a custom that I release someone for you at the Passover. Do you wish then that I release for you the King of the Jews named Jesus? Matthew gives us a little more details in his version of this. Matthew chapter 27. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. At that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner named Barabbas. Now, focus on that name. You're going to hear it a lot in the next few minutes. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who's called the Christ or the Messiah? I think Pilate got his hopes up. Because here's what he thought. Now watch me, follow me, church. Here's what he thought. Surely this angry mob of people, given the choice between me releasing Barabbas or releasing Jesus, surely they'll demand that I release Jesus. It was what we would call today a no-brainer, right? It's a decision that requires no thoughts. Nobody in their right mind had rather have Barabbas walking the streets of Jerusalem at night instead of Jesus out walking free in public. Why do we say that? Why was it such an easy choice? Well, because we know what we know about this man named Barabbas. John tells us that Barabbas was a robber. Now that's bad, but it's not the worst thing in the world if you think about it. Matthew tells us that Barabbas was a notorious criminal, right? He was a criminal of note, of name. That meant he had a bad reputation. And if you just said the word in Jerusalem, Barabbas, everybody would know who you're talking about and why. It would be like us saying the name Charles Manson, right? Everybody knows the name. There's a reputation connected to it. Mark tells us that this man named Barabbas was an insurrectionist. That meant he was a revolutionary. He had tried to overthrow the Roman government by means of violence. Mark also tells us that he was a murderer. So that means in the process of trying to overthrow the government, he had killed at least one person. So now we're getting a pretty good rap sheet, right? He's a robber, he's an insurrectionist, he's a murderer. You see why Pilate thought, surely no one in their right mind had rather have Barabbas walking free rather than Jesus. So Pilate goes out to the crowd. I can see it in my mind's eye, can't you? And he's got his hopes up. He's got his little pep in his steps. And he goes, guess what? I figured it out. You have a tradition that I release to you one guilty criminal at this time of the year. Do you want me to release Jesus or Barabbas? You're beginning to think, I've got this, right? I'm off the hook. There will be no uprising from the Jews, no unpleasant meeting with Tiberius. But what happened to Pilate's plan? Well, that leads us to the third point that I want you to see, and that is the people's demands. People's demands. Can you imagine Pilate's shock when the crowd chose Barabbas to be released? The people said, don't give us Jesus, instead give us Barabbas. We want Barabbas, give us Barabbas. If you read all four accounts of this, and it's recorded in some fashion in all four gospel accounts, you find that the crowd is getting louder and louder and more hostile and more out of control. That worked against Pilate. I imagine he felt the pressure growing. And he asked him again, just to be sure he'd heard right, Are you sure? One more time. Who should I release? Jesus or Barabbas? And they said, give us Barabbas. And then in puzzlement, I think, and frustration and desperation, Pilate asked the question of his day and the question of our day. Then what do I do with Jesus? What then shall I do with Jesus? He was thoroughly stumped. If I release Barabbas, then I've got to do something with Jesus. What do I do with him? Right? That was the question. People said, crucify him. Crucify him. The verb tense here means they didn't just say it one or two times. They kept shouting it over and over and over again. Presumably, these were some of the same people who had shouted over and over again a few days ago, Hosanna to the King. Now they were demanding Jesus be crucified. And at that point, fearing a riot, Pilate felt he had no choice. He washed his hands. You know that tradition, right? Say that, well, I'm washing my hands of the whole affair. This is where it came from. Kind of an Old Testament thing that Pilate carried. He literally took water, and in front of the people, he washed his hands. And he was saying symbolically what? I am not guilty here. This is all on you. I am not held responsible for what you did to this man. But guess what? He really was responsible still, wasn't he? He could wash his hands until they bled, and he was still partly responsible for what happened to Jesus. because he failed to do the right thing. So he sent Jesus away to be crucified. The people demanded it, and Pilate gave in. And so what's the big picture here? You got it in your mind? You got what's going on here? Pilate had a dilemma. He came up with a surefire plan. But then the bloodthirsty crowd demanded Jesus be killed. Pilate sent him away. Now at this point, we need to ask what we need to take away from this morning. What kind of application can we talk about? I don't want to do that before we go for just a minute. And I came up with two. I saw two. There's probably more, but let me give you the first one. And I want y'all to pay very careful attention here. This is the heart of the message and the most important thing you'll hear this morning from me. Application number one. Jesus dying in the place of Barabbas is a powerful picture of our salvation. Jesus dying in the place of Barabbas is a powerful picture of our salvation. Now, I don't know this for sure. I can't prove it. But I'm wondering if God did not want us to have one more picture of salvation just before the cross. I'm wondering if God did not come up with all of this to say, I'm going to give them one more visual before Jesus dies so that they see why Jesus died, right? The Bible is full of pictures of our salvation, even before Jesus died. Y'all understand that? The Bible is full of pictures of our salvation. You go back to the Old Testament and you over again. For instance, you see in Genesis when Abraham carried his son, his only son, out to the place that God said, take him and sacrifice him. And just before Abraham killed his son, God said, stop. There's a ram over here caught in the bushes. Bring it over here and sacrifice it in the place of your son. Picture. That's a picture. And then you get to the Passover feast itself. You get to the end of the Israelites' captivity in Egypt. And on the night they left, remember what God told them? Remember what God told Israel? Take a lamb, kill it, take the blood and put it over the doorpost of your home. And when the death angel passes over, he will see the blood and you will be saved. Picture of our salvation. Later on, the people were in the wilderness. They were disobedient to God. God sent poisonous snakes to bite them. They cried out to be saved. Oh, please save us. God said, all right, we're going to take this thing, this serpent, and we're going to raise it up. And you look to that in faith, and you'll be saved. Picture of salvation. There are more. But I think in hours before the cross, God gives us another picture in this man named Barabbas. Now you hear me, let me tell you about Barabbas. He was a rightly condemned man facing the death penalty for his crimes. When I say rightly condemned, you know what I mean by that, right? He deserved to die. He was guilty of everything he had been accused of. He was in a cell at the time, waiting to be crucified. In fact, he was only a couple of hundred yards away from where the crowd was. And I wonder when the crowd was shouting to Pilate, crucify him, crucify him. Barabbas was in his cell wondering if they were talking about him. There was nothing Barabbas could do to save himself at that point. The situation was hopeless. He was facing the death penalty. He couldn't go back and change what he had done. He couldn't go back and make up for what he had done. There was no time for restoration or restitution. The only way, hear me church, the only way he could be saved from death was if another person stepped in and died in his place. See where I'm going with this? And that's exactly what Jesus did. That's exactly what Jesus did. I can just imagine the guards come to the cell of Barabbas and he's thinking, well, this is it. I'm on the way. I've only got a few more minutes. And they open the cell and they say, Barabbas, you're free. What? How is that? How is that? Somebody's going to die in your place. In the case of Barabbas, Jesus literally took his place on the cross. Some scholars believe, you remember the picture of the cross, right? You got two on each side of the one in the middle, and there are two criminals on each side. Some scholars believe that the middle cross The one that Jesus would eventually occupy was where Barabbas was headed. And that these were his two fellow henchmen. But Barabbas didn't end up on the middle cross, did he? He went free, and Jesus died in his place. Barabbas was saved because Jesus took his place on the cross. Now you think about it. The guilty went free because the innocent died his death and took his penalty and paid for his crimes. That's salvation. You hear me? That's salvation. The guilty went free because the innocent died, took his penalty, and paid for his crimes. That's the Christian faith. That's our faith. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. The simplest understanding of salvation, dear church, is this: Jesus took our place. If anybody asks you, what does it mean to be a Christian? In the simplest terms, it means these 4 words: Jesus took my place. We were the guilty. We were deserving of death and hell. We were rightly found guilty and on our way. But the innocent one, Jesus, took our place, and He suffered God's wrath on the cross that we deserved. He died our death and paid for our sins. Look at 2 Corinthians 5:21. 2 Corinthians 5:21. Here it is in a verse. He, that's God the Father, made Him, that's Jesus, who knew no sin, to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in Him. That's the cross right there. That is, Jesus took my place. May I say to you, I started to say, let me apologize for saying this, but I don't apologize. We are all Barabbas. That's just a fact. We are all Barabbas, guilty, rebels against God, deserving of death and the wrath of God, but Jesus died in our place, just like He died in the place of Barabbas. Now, do you understand that the crimes of Barabbas did not go unpunished? The crimes of Barabbas were paid for. They were not wiped off the books, swept under the rug, and forgotten about. They were paid for, just not by Barabbas. They were paid for by the substitute, by the one who took His place, by Jesus. Our sins don't go unpunished. Our sins are not swept under the rug and forgotten about, or God would not be God. We just don't pay for them. Jesus pays for them. He's our substitute. He took our place. Just like Barabbas walked out of death row that day, a free man, so we are freed from the prison of sin and bondage when we believe in Jesus. Not because of anything we can do ourselves, not because we can make restitution for our sin, not because we can do good enough to somehow offset the evil that we have committed, but because Jesus took our place. Somebody put it this way: at the cross, God treats Jesus as we deserve to be treated, so that He can treat us as Jesus deserved to be treated. Right? That's it. That's it in a nutshell. Now, one more time. Our salvation is summed up in these 4 words: Jesus took our place. Barabbas. Powerful picture of our salvation. Now, one more application, and this one's really short, right? Y'all pay attention, though. Not the time to fold your Bible and get ready to go to lunch. Right? Every person must make the same decision about Jesus. You with me? Either crown Him or crucify Him. And when I say every person must make the same decision, I mean the same decision as Pilate made. Every person, every single one of us has to make the same decision that Pilate made. Are we going to crown Jesus His rightful place as King and Lord and Messiah and God, or are we going to proceed to the cross and crucify Him? What then shall I do with Jesus? What should I do with Jesus? That's the question of the day for Pilate, and it's the question of the day for us. Every single person who has ever been born on the face of the earth must answer this question. You say, well, I'm just going to choose not to answer it. You can't choose not to answer it, because in choosing not to answer it, you're answering it. Everybody must answer the question, what will I do with Jesus? Will I crown Him King and Lord of my heart and surrender to Him and die to self and pick up my cross and follow Him daily as His follower? Or will I take the side of Pilate and the religious leaders and the Roman authorities and I crucify Jesus? Those are the only two choices. There is no third choice. There is no opt-out. There is no neutrality. There is no way to avoid making the decision. Every single person must make the decision. No one can make the decision for another person. A parent can't make the decision for a child. A child can't make a decision for his friend. We all make the decision for ourselves. What shall I do with Jesus? Let me say this. If you choose to make Jesus your King, your Lord, your boss, if you crown Him in your heart, you will never, ever regret it. You'll never, ever regret it. I promise you that. There'll be times when you're wondering, what did I sign up for? I had a lot easier life before I became a follower of Jesus, but I'll tell you, in the end, you will never, ever regret it. And He will never, ever let you go. He will hold you fast. He will hold you fast, right? He will never lose you. He will never forsake you. So I ask you this morning, whether you're here in the building, whether you're watching us online, what is your answer to the question of the ages? The most important question you'll ever hear and answer. What will you do with Jesus? Will you crown Him or will you crucify Him? Will you crown Him or crucify Him? I want you to stand, if you would do me that honor, and bow your head and close your eyes. And this is the time of introspection and submission and decision. It's the time where you decide before you walk out the door, is everything right in my life? If I died today, I know what would happen to me, and I'm good with that. Or maybe I know that I'm not good with God, and I need to repent. Now's the time of decision. Heads are bowed, eyes are closed, and I invite you to come. That's always the invitation to come, not to the preacher, not to the church, but to Jesus this morning. Maybe there's something else going on in your life I don't know about, nobody else knows about, and you're broken and you're crushed and you're scared. And you'd come and say, Pastor, would you just pray with me this morning? Would you pray with me? I'm about at the end. I'm about to lose it. Or maybe this morning you'd say, Pastor, I've been coming to this church for 6 months or a year, and I need to connect to this church and be a member here so that I can be accountable, participate more. You need to come and make that decision this morning. We're going to wait just a moment for God to work in your heart. We're going to wait. I'll watch for you.